You're very welcome to today's GPS webinar on writing a successful funding application or writing a successful funding proposal. And what we're going to look at today is just some advice and some guidance, perhaps, with regard to the application process and things that reviewers look for. And just maybe this will provide you with some insights into what to avoid. First of all, because reviewers don't like to be irritated by anything that appears in a proposal. They like to have one that is fluent and clean and that reads particularly well. And more importantly, I guess we want to impart what's important in a proposal. What are the things that can really help you to gain that very important funding that you need for your research? So before we begin and get into the more formal aspects of the webinar, I'm just going to give you some background into funding bodies and who they are. These are ones that I'm sure many of you are very familiar with. We have, for example, Government of Ireland Postgraduate Scheme, which is perhaps the most perhaps one of the most prestigious postgraduate funding schemes that is currently available. Science Foundation Ireland programs, of course, so many of you avail of these or try to avail of these. Health research boards obviously are another source of funding. And then you have others. I've just put in some examples there, such as, for example, the Fulbright HRB Health Impact Award and the National Parents Council Primary Invite to Tender, which you may see every now and again, or the Health Education Authority Research Impact Award. Impact we've spoken about on previous webinars. I'm not going to dwell on it here, but it's just an example of the kind of funding streams that are available. So there are many more apart from these, and of course there are internal university mandated internal scholarships also. I'm not going to talk about those. I'm going to concentrate more perhaps on external agencies and how to gain funding from those. So just to consider questions that you should perhaps consider, which I think are important when you are thinking of and beginning to write your funding application. The first one I would say is consider, this is, if you like, the agency that you're or organization that you're seeking money from is likely to be a publicly funded body. So that organization has a mandate, it has a responsibility and a duty to the public to spend and allocate its funds wisely. So if you look at it from the agency's perspective, they have to think, well, is it worth spending public money on this research? So think, first of all, before you begin, can you think of a reason why anyone would spend or justify spending public money on your research? Now, obviously, there are other sources of funding, private agencies and charitable trusts, etc. But for the most part, many of you will be applying to publicly funded bodies. So that is a question to consider. How can the agency or the organization justify spending public money on your research? So think of, why your research is important. Think of who it's going to benefit. Who are the people ultimately who do benefit? And they use terms, I hate this term stakeholders, but it's used ubiquitously in terms of funding. But who's going to benefit? Who is going to derive the most benefit from your research? And who is it going to be of use to? Who are the end users of that research going to be? Now, for some of you, this may be a very difficult question and one that you will find very, very hard to answer because it's so nebulous, the whole idea of who your research is going to benefit. But dwell upon it before you apply and think upon it and try and imagine who could ultimately benefit from your research. And that is another consideration that reviewers take into account. It doesn't always have to be the most important criterion when it comes to funding, or it doesn't mean that your funding application is going to be rejected, but it's a question that is worth considering. Think of what evidence there is that your research will fill a gap in the knowledge. And of course, for so many of you, particularly those of you doing a PhD, you have to think, well, my research is going to be contribution to knowledge. So it is going to fill a particular gap in the knowledge that is there. If you're doing a professional doctorate, obviously, you'll be thinking about a contribution to professional practice. But think about how your research will fill that particular gap. What is your research going to do? This will help you also to answer other questions like why your research is important. So think about how it's going to build on what's already there, what's going to be different about your research, all of these things, what makes it stand out. All of these things are important questions to consider. And just think of, is your research, is it innovative? Is it timely? Is it responding to perhaps a new kind of a new phenomenon or a new trend in your research field? Just dwell upon those, I would say, before you begin your application, because they're worth considering. It doesn't mean that, as I say, if you fail to answer any of these questions, it doesn't mean that your funding application will be rejected. But I think questions like, how your research will fill a gap in the knowledge are particularly salient when it comes to funding bodies and their decision-making processes. Okay, so think about, what the focus of your research project is. So, just dwell for a moment and just think about, your own topic and what that is. And just try and reflect for a moment or two on why your particular topic is important. Because for those of you, obviously, those of you doing a PhD, so many of you become so immersed in the whole process of writing and engagement with the PhD that so many of us begin to think that this is the most important topic that there is, and it's sometimes difficult to imagine that people would not be interested in this topic. But it's important for you to convince others of the importance of the topic. So just think about why you think your own topic is important. I would say that's a really important question to dwell upon before you apply for funding. Obviously, and this can be a deal breaker when it comes to funding. Think about what research questions are you trying to answer. And I'll talk about the research questions in a lot more detail as we go on, because that is so fundamental to what you're trying to do. What is your hypothesis? Again, very, very important for so many of you in particular disciplines to answer that particular question. What research methods are you going to use? And indeed, I'll just dwell later on for a couple of moments upon the difference between methods, the tools that you use to answer your research question, and methodology, the rationale for your research approach and the strategy that you take. So there are particular differences between methods and methodology, which might be useful for you to discern and to impart and to include in your funding application. And think, obviously, again, why your research is important. What is its significant? What is the ultimate impact of your research going to be? Now, nobody expects that your PhD is going to have this, enormous impact in your field necessarily, as brilliant as your PhD may be, or what long-term impact. But it can contribute, it can make a contribution, obviously, to new knowledge, but can make a contribution to having an impact in the field or to wider society. So think about that, and it is really, really worth considering because it helps you to build a convincing case for your research funding application. Think about, as I say, your methodology. Are you using quantitative methods, qualitative methods, or both? What kind of approach are you taking? Will you be conducting experimental research or clinical research? So think about, for example, with regard to clinical research and the ethical implications that may have, and perhaps some of the ethical barriers that you need to surmount before you gain approval to conduct your research. These are some of the essentials when it comes to a successful funding proposal. The proposal itself, it has to be coherent. It has to have a strong narrative. The parts of the proposal should not be very separate from each other. They should form part of a coherent whole. And that's an important part of a funding application, there must be a clear rationale for the research questions posed, why it is that you are proposing these. And again, it comes back to convincing the funders of the importance of your research. Again, I just think that's so important to stress, that it is so important that you're able to justify, the importance of your research, why it is a necessary thing to do. Again, that can be difficult to convince others. As I say, so many people doing a PhD become so bound up in the whole process that it's difficult to think outside of this, if you like, outside of the PhD bubble, and to think coherently about why your research is important. But really, you have to convince others of its importance. So you can do so by providing a clear rationale for the research questions that you've posed. And as I say, your research questions will be like your anchor in so many ways for the whole project, and so important. And the used should be appropriate to the research proposed. There's no point, in saying, that I'm going to use, for example, I'm going to use grounded theory when you may be engaged in something like a quantitative experimental study. It sometimes that may not, there may not be a match between, say, the methodology that you use and the research that you're proposing to conduct. And it must be feasible and realistic. There's no point in submitting an application which claims, that it's going to provide long-lasting, sustainable development to the world, or long-lasting freedom from conflict, or that it's going to solve problems relating to, for example, gender equality. It must be feasible and realistic. Your PhD is not going to necessarily solve climate change, so it has to be something which is feasible. It is, for example, you would be looking at, for the most part, a 4-year project. So think about what's feasible, what's realistic within that particular time frame. You have limitations with regard to finances, with regard to access to facilities, access to participants. There are so many barriers, if you like, to conducting ambitious research, but you have to work within those parameters. And obviously, you have to create a feasible and realistic plan for the funding body to adjudicate, because it's only that, only by doing a realistic PhD that, or a PhD that is ambitious, but not overly ambitious in what it's trying to do, or what it claims it's going to do. Obviously, you would need strong references, and these tend to be strong academic references. Some funding bodies say that you can have a reference from somebody whose research is, who knows about your research, who's, for whom your research is familiar to them. So make sure that you get good people who are familiar with the research, but also are credible people and have, strong professional standing. And obviously, you have to pay attention to what's called the research environment. So you have to think about the structures and supports that are there. You have to think about the feasibility of conducting, particular kinds of field work. You have to think about data collection. You have to think about, your analysis. There are so many elements with regard to the research environment that you must pay attention to, and you must, as I said, devise a clear, feasible, realistic plan and a schedule. And obviously, when so many of the funding agencies now look for things like milestone charts or Gantt charts as well, which can guide you with regard to providing timelines for the funding body. I've put in here something called golden rules of research proposal writing. And in a sense, many of these have been collated from the various funding bodies, and looking at what criteria they have provided for a successful application. So something that is important actually is, if you are applying to a funding body, be it, as I say, Science Foundation Ireland, or the Irish Research Council, or the Health Research Board, or for example, the Wellcome Trust, or Cancer Research UK, for example, examine the priorities of that funding body. So see what their objective is. Examine their mission statement. See what their mandate is, what their objectives are as a funding body, and that's something that is worth taking into account when you're writing your proposal. It's not something you need to integrate into your proposal, but it's something worth considering and keeping in mind. I would say what is important, though, is that you link what you want to do with what that funding body wants to know. So make sure that if you are engaged, for example, with, I mentioned the Wellcome Trust would be an example, a huge benefactor when it comes to the dispersal of funding. The Wellcome Trust, its primary focus would be, for example, on biomedical research. So there's little point, for example, in applying to an agency like that, unless your area and what you want to do is linked in with what the funding body wants. So that's something also to keep in mind. But also, it should also be kept in mind on a more positive note that many funding bodies, like for example the Irish Research Council, that they take applications from a very, very wide range of disciplines and fields. Okay. Also, and also because this is again is really significant, I think. But think about the time that you are going to invest, and do, if you like, a kind of I won't say a cost benefit analysis, but think about the potential or the counterfactual of not applying. Do you think that by not applying but think of the time invested into the application, and think, if I invest this amount of time, I may acquire this benefit at the end. So think about, the amount of time that is going, because it will take you a lot of time to write a proposal. The beauty of writing a proposal, though, and writing a good proposal, is that it's something that you can use or you can refine for later applications also, and for different types of funding applications. But I would say that it's better to submit a small number of applications, but to put the greatest effort into those. So if you are going to apply, and again, think of the time that will be invested, I think it's better just to put a huge effort into it, because it will take up a lot of time. Now, there are other huge benefits to writing funding applications, which may not be very obvious at the time, even for those of you who fail to get funding. Because one of the great advantages of writing a funding application for Science Foundation Ireland or for the Irish Research Council is that you can, by dint of doing your proposal and by dint of writing your funding application, it can help you to formulate, to crystallize, to think and reflect more profoundly on the research that you're doing. So even though you may not be successful in the funding application, it will give you a much clearer and better insight into the type of research that you're doing. And that in itself can be invaluable. So you may feel, well, the time I've invested a huge amount of time, my application has been successful. That can be very, very traumatic for many people, and it can be the first instance, if you like, of a form of rejection for many people in the academic world. And people do take rejection of that kind very personally when it's not meant to be in any way. But it can really have a detrimental effect on people's well-being, not getting funding. But you have to think about that the time invested may well be very, very worthwhile, because you have reached a point where you have improved things, you've refined and you've honed your research question, you've become much more reflective as a researcher. So it may seem like a waste of time, but I will guarantee that you will be a much better researcher by giving all of your effort into the funding application process. Okay, I think also it's important to develop a style that communicates your work quickly and effectively, so that you don't become too too caught up in impenetrable or incomprehensible jargon. Develop a style that in which you can really impart a strong message to the reviewers. You should state and justify your objectives clearly. And again, just as I talked about a difference between research methods and research methodology, you should also reflect on the difference between aims and objectives, because I think that isn't necessarily going to be a difference when it comes to getting funding. But if you can distinguish between things like aims and objectives and write those into the proposal, it conveys an idea for the reviewers that you are a reflective researcher and that you've really thought about, the whole research process, that you're not just merely accepting the language, that is, that you're not merely, if you like, accepting what has things like concepts such as aims and objectives, methods and methodology. It means that you're reflective, that you have thought about the distinction between both, and that you are, if you like, a profound thinker, and that you have, if you like, a strong intellectual capacity and capability for doing the research. It's just a little thing. It can be a tiny thing in some instances, but it does convey and portray you as a reflective and capable researcher. And as I say, again and again, I'm going to say this, demonstrate whether research is necessary and assess the impact or the potential impact. Because again, impact of your research may not be for years and years and years. There may be no impact whatsoever, but it is just worth discussing and distinguishing how your research is different from others, what kind of impact, impact it's going to have on your discipline or on your society or on society in general. It's also good that if you don't have any experience with regard to funding, that you get and you collaborate with people who have experience. I think that is something which is fundamental. That you do lean on people who have experience of getting funding, because they will have insights, they will have tips, they will even have, dare I say it, shortcuts, which can help you to make a more efficient use of your time when it comes to the funding application process. I would say identify a mentor or a supervisor and discuss your idea with them and get feedback also. Try and get as much feedback as possible. And I know in UL there are internal mechanisms, and they have very, very good processes in place for the Irish Research Council for the vetting of applications. But it's always good to discuss your potential or your planned application with either your supervisor or your mentor in advance. What's also important with regard to the funding application itself, excuse me, I'll just repeat that. What's important with regard to the funding application itself is that the reviewers feel enthusiastic about the proposal. When they read it, they think this is great. That really gets them engaged. And if the reviewers are enthusiastic about the proposal, they will be more predisposed to funding that research. It doesn't mean that if your reviewers are hugely enthusiastic that it will get funded, but it means, as I say, they will be more sympathetic, more predisposed to funding your application. And again, this is a negative aspect which I just want you to dwell upon for a moment or two. Don't frustrate the reviewers, don't irritate them by having them look through your proposal to find what the central idea is, because it's likely that the reviewers will be looking at a large number of applications and they will be thinking, oh my, they will be almost in certain instances looking for an excuse to not fund certain proposals. So if your central idea is not clear, that becomes very, very difficult for them to justify giving you funding and for them to use public funding to support your research. So that is really, really important. I think this is worth looking at. This is from a book called What Do Grant Reviewers Really Want Anyway by Robert Porter. And he said that in this is a reviewer's comment, which was, if I don't get interested by the first page, the proposal is lost. So that is not necessarily what all reviewers think, but it's quite a substantial number of them, I would argue, think with regard to research proposals, because they have a huge number of typically a huge number of research proposals to assess. So if you lose them, if you lose the interest of the reviewers by the first page, it can mean that the whole thing, it can be very, very difficult to re-engage someone if they lose interest after the initial stages. So think about, what you're going to do, how you're going to construct your abstract, for example, and think about how you can make that into a successful and a winning proposal, and one that will hold the attention of the reviewers. I would say also, and again, this comes back to the reviewers, that some reviewers are non-specialists. So think, and again, many of the funding bodies, they put a big emphasis on this, about how you would communicate your research to a non-specialist audience. They want to see evidence of that, many of them. So, for example, the Irish Research Council insists upon what they call a lay abstract. And by means of a lay abstract, this signifies that they want to see you show how you communicate to people who are not specialists, people who don't understand things like epistemology or ontology or axiology. So they want to see you convey and communicate your research in a way that would be understandable to people outside of academia. And again, it's all tied in with the agenda of many of the funding bodies and governmental agencies, that they want to see people looking at careers beyond academia. I know for most of you, your aspirations will be to work within academia, but many of the policymakers and funding agencies really want people to reflect also on how they're going to prepare themselves for a life beyond academia, and they see communication and communicating your research and that message as being really vital and a part of that important process also. Obviously, adhere to the guidelines. I think that goes without saying, but it's amazing how many people sometimes fail to adhere to all of the guidelines. Allow plenty of time. Yes, I think, as I said earlier, you're going to have to invest a huge amount of your own time into the process, and think about, the if you like, the counterfactual of that. What if I didn't dedicate this amount of time? How much of my own research would evolve and continue if I hadn't invested all that time into the application? But as I say, I think my own feeling is that it's well worth investing the time in an application, because it helps you to reflect more deeply on your research. It makes you a better researcher, makes you more clear-headed about where you're going, helps you see, if you like, the bigger picture of where your research is headed and what you are doing, and helps you to clarify things, and such as the research question and things like your research methods, your methodology, and thinking about your analysis. Ultimately, you should have other people read your proposal to get another really, really useful, to have another voice, another pair of eyes on the proposal. I would say that the introduction to the application, there are certain aspects of that I think really, as I say, that reviewer's comment earlier about how it's so vital to get the reviewer's attention in the first page, and if you lose them after the first, if you lose them in the first page, so difficult to get them back. So think about, the introduction to your application and how important that is, and why it should have it should be very well written. That's a good way to get your readers' attention. So make sure that it has a style which engages the reviewers. This is an opportunity for you. So think of it as an opportunity because you really here have a chance to show the reviewers why research is cutting edge, why it's new, why it is so important, and why it ultimately justifies getting funding. So another thing that's important to do here in the introduction is to provide background information. Now, I said literature review there, but obviously if you're in the initial stages of your PhD, or if you haven't even begun your PhD yet, you won't be expected to have a comprehensive literature review. But your literature review, or your initial stages of the literature review, is so important because it will help you to find that gap in the knowledge, to find that gap in the literature that you are trying to fill. So I would say here that, provide background information, meaning show that there is a gap in the knowledge that you are going to fill. And again, that is a sine qua non. It's a fundamental prerequisite of any PhD, that it does make a contribution to knowledge, and it, in certain instances, advances the discipline. So I think that what an introduction should also show, or perhaps just following on from the previous point, that you're using background information, it helps you demonstrate your knowledge, that you have good knowledge of the literature that is there, and it helps you frame the wider and it helps you, if you like, place your research into a wider context. And again, all of these things are really important. Some of these things here, and I apologize for the blizzard of information that's coming out, but what I think a lot of these things are worth doing is reflecting on afterwards. So when you get the slides, and if you have the tolerations to look again at this recording, just reflect upon certain elements of what's in here, because I think, as I say, what I've tried to do is to collate what the funding bodies themselves want. So I've tried to collate those into a coherent presentation here. And by doing so, I hope that just provides you with insight and guidance for your own funding applications. And as I say, again, this is almost a form of repetition, identify any gap in the knowledge or any questions that need to be answered. So again, this is taken as a standard and should be integrated into your application. Again, the introduction here is a good opportunity for you to demonstrate your awareness of different methodologies. For example, you could be having to distinguish between, for example, ethnography and, for example, ethnomethodology, or phenomenology. So just think about how or what methodologies you're using, and it's just a good way for you to demonstrate to the reviewers your awareness of those particular concepts. And it also allows you to demonstrate awareness of research methods also. Again, I'm just going to talk briefly about the distinction between methods and methodology, because I think it's an important one, and one that many people often conflate. Just as I say, they conflate aims and objectives when the differences between them are quite subtle, but worth contemplating. So think about the aims, and again here I've made the mistake of putting them together, aims and objectives. And again, but I think it's important to distinguish your aim from your objective, and a brief description of the methodology that you are going to be using. And I would say also to use key research papers or public documents for your introduction. I always think that if you're an external funding body, it's always good to show that your research is tied in to, for example, if you're going for a Government of Ireland scholarship or Science Foundation Ireland scholarship, it's always good to show that you're aware of the public domain, of what the policy goals are. So, for example, if you are in health sciences and you're doing something on the greening of cities and how the greening of cities can help people to exercise more, You can think then of how greater exercise leads to, if you like, reduction in things like cardiovascular diseases, or reduction in diabetes, or reduction in respiratory illnesses. And think about that at a national policy level. And think about, for example, the government would have, say, a strategy to tackle obesity, and you could link the research you're doing into this policy document or into this policy goal. So I think it's always a good idea to do that, to link what you're doing into national objectives, because that, I think, provides a more convincing case for why you should get funding, and it helps to convince the reviewers that your research is important. And again, that answers the questions which I've put here. How is your research beneficial, and to whom? Why should it be funded? Again, I'm repeating a lot of things here, but I think they're worth repeating because these are the questions which the reviewers ask. So specify in your introduction, specify the topic that you're studying, state your research questions, your hypothesis, or the theoretical framework that you're using, set the boundaries, because obviously, as I say, you have to be realistic. It's a 4-year PhD with all that, and you are working sometimes under severe limitations of all kinds, be it financial, or be it with regard to time pressures or caring. Be realistic about what it is you can do. So set the boundaries, and that will provide you with a clear focus. And again, this is why your research question is so important here, because as I've stated so often, it's so important that you write to the question, that and that will be your guiding light, your North Star with regard to your research. And it's so fundamental that you follow that, because otherwise you can lose focus and you can become embroiled in the whole wider literature, and and it will lose you will end up losing focus on your question and what it is you're ultimately trying to do. Define key concepts wherever that's appropriate. So think about what the key concepts are with regard to your research. Just in terms of style, I won't dwell too long on this, but I think it is important, and I've mentioned it already. Provide an informative project title, structure your text, and if you can, to use section headings, because it will help to break up and just make it easier for the reviewers to assess and indeed to look at and to read your application. I think also to presenting the information in short paragraphs is very, very useful. Also, short sentences, I think, that avoid jargon, that avoid complicated language, because it could be non-experts reading your proposal, non-specialists in your field. They will be experts in certain areas, but they may not be experts in your particular discipline, your particular field of study. So that's why I think that the short sentences, short paragraphs convey a better message than convoluted, very complex multi-case sentences, which really become almost impenetrable and difficult to read. And if you are allowed, and many of the funding bodies do allow you to use milestone charts and Gantt charts, etc., and use these where possible. Your abstract again is a really key area, I think, because so many of the reviewers will look to your abstract and take from that the essence of what it is you're trying to do. So this is your opportunity. Look on the abstract as an opportunity for you to convince the reviewers of why your research is important, why it's worth funding, and what gap it's going to fill in the literature, or what gap it's going to fill in the literature and in the field, what contribution it's going to make to knowledge, what methods and methodology you're going to use. There's so much that you can get in here, even though sometimes abstracts are confined to 300 words, for example. I've seen that in funding bodies. But it really is a good opportunity for you. Here is a really, really good chance to convince the reviewers of why you should be funded. So it should include the research question. And again, I'll talk about this in a little more detail. The rationale for what you're trying to do, your hypothesis, if it's applicable, the methods that you're going to use, and again, research question. And again, I just mentioned that earlier. and just how critical it is. Just that it will define the proposal. It will guide so many of your arguments and your inquiry, and it will provoke the interest of the reviewer. And again, I always come back to the point that was made in a workshop. Excuse me, a workshop for supervisors that I attended long after I'd finished my own PhD, and I heard this piece of advice and thought, oh my God, if I had known that throughout my own PhD, that would have been just superb. And the piece of advice came from someone who had supervised many PhD, I think well over 100 PhD students. And the advice that he gave was that I always tell my students to write to the question, to take the question, the research question, to stick it on their laptop or on their workspace or on their PC, and to keep it there and to be guided by that and not to be distracted from the question, because that is what you are trying to answer. So that I heard that and I thought, oh my God, that is actually, it's in many ways obvious advice, but it's superb advice also. And it's something which I think, you should take on board, because the research question really is so vital, not only to a funding application, but to your research overall. And as I've said, and again, those of you who are frequent attenders of these webinars will be fed up of me saying it, but you've probably heard me say this about 10,000 times at this stage, that the writing a research question is an iterative process. That means that you're refining and you're honing it, going back to it, and you're analyzing it again before you finally come up with a final research question. I know when I began my own PhD that I began with a research question that was too general, too broad, too ambitious for the time frame as well. And I had to refine it and hone it and bring it down into a much more manageable and feasible and realistic proposition before I could really begin to work on answering that particular question. So your funders or your funding body, the funding body that you're applying to, really want to see evidence that you have thought about the research question. They may not, in certain cases, it may be the case that you apply to a funding body with a research question. By the time you get funded or begin the period of funding, that your own research question has changed, and there's no disgrace in that, and usually not a great deal of difficulty in informing the reviewers about that. But that happens, and that can be taken as natural, that as you delve more into your topic, as you undergo the process of data collection and data analysis, you may even find that, my God, I need to refine my research question here. So it can be a continual process. I won't say that it continues right up to the time of submission, but it can be a process that can take a long time to get right. As I say, it's iterative, meaning that you're refining it for quite some time. It's very unusual for someone to begin a PhD with a research question that is already set in stone. That would be extremely unusual. So if you have a research question, if you're still working on your research questions, don't despair, because it's something which people have to work a lot on to get right. But in a funding application, you will have to commit to paper a strong research question in order to convince the reviewers, and you must show then that your use of methods is, if you like, aligned with your research question. And if your question doesn't work well, if you're trying to do something that is simply not feasible or not realistic, your proposal is likely to be unsuccessful. And as an aspect of a funding application, I think this is true. This is something which came about at a workshop where somebody pointed out that it was common for that I remember one particular reviewer saying, or a reviewer who was also an academic in a Dublin-based university, who said that it was common for her students to spend more time on researching, on conceptualizing, and on forming the research question than on any other part of the funding application. So think about that. That's really, so that, conveys just how critical it is that you have a good and strong research question or research questions when it comes to the application process. In order to write, so what could help you to write a strong research question? First of all, think about, consider what drew you to this topic? What attracted you to this? Why is this topic for you? Why are you a good fit for this particular area? And I think also, although it's not always going to be possible to do this, but research questions that can demonstrate their relevance to society, to social groups, or to scholarly literature and debates are likely to be given more credence and more weight, or perhaps even more more sympathy by the reviewers. Because if you can link your research questions, and if you can link your project into a debate with regarding wider society, or with regard to the scholarly literature, then I think that really is helps, because that therefore you can demonstrate, that will then help you to demonstrate, first of all, why your research is so important, why it should be funded, and then also what the impact, and this you can demonstrate here, what the impact of your research is potentially going to be. Excuse me. And again, your research questions, they have to be doable. They have to be realistic. There's no point in providing a research question which has an overly ambitious or unrealistic aim. The literature review, of course, and again, I did back in the summer a webinar about the literature review, and I'll be repeating that in the near future, because literature review is just, is so important. And indeed, there's a lot of there's quite an amount now of research to show that so many PhD students, they find the whole process of doing a PhD, the most difficult stages of doing that can be, for example, between the conceptualization stage, where many choices have to be made with regard to the research, and writing a literature review, because many students can feel almost overwhelmed by having to plan and to organize and to write a literature review, within certain academic writing conventions. So that can be, it can be a tricky stage for people, the literature review, but it's one that you can all overcome, because it may seem very intimidating and overwhelming at first, but working with your supervisors, your mentor, you should be able to overcome this particular aspect of your project. So it encompasses, if you like, a thorough review of the literature, and it ensures, and why a literature review is so important is because it ensures that you're not doing research that was done before. So that is why, when we think of a PhD, it's a contribution to knowledge. So it can't be an exact replica of what has been done before. So your literature review will help you to demonstrate, to the examiners, but also to funding bodies, that you are doing research that hasn't been done before. It gives credit for those who have gone before you, who have laid all the groundwork for your research, and it demonstrates your own knowledge of the research problem. So, as I say, a literature review can be very problematic for people who have come onto a program and never ever dealt with anything as large as this before, or as unwieldy as a literature review before. Or sometimes people struggle with a literature review because they're not sure what the purpose of the literature review actually is. So it's very important that that is pointed out to you. You know, I think if you were to ask me why do a literature review, I would say to ensure you're not doing research done before, but also that, and more importantly, I guess, that it identifies a gap in the literature, a gap in the knowledge that you are going to fill. So again, apologies for the repetition, but I just think that these issues are so important that they do need to be stressed again and again. And again, just with regard to the literature review, what it does, it demonstrates your understanding of the theoretical and research issues that are related to your research question. And it shows your ability to critically evaluate relevant literature. So again, coming back to a webinar which we did a few weeks ago, with regard to the importance of critical thinking, and I think the title of that webinar was Critical Thinking in Your PhD, and a question mark, the hardest doctoral skill of all, and that's where the question mark was. And that is, if you like, almost a rhetorical question, because critical thinking can be the most difficult doctoral skill of all to master. But critical thinking really comes to the fore with regard to your literature review, because here you have to critically evaluate relevant literature. It's not just a case of saying that somebody wrote about this particular aspect. You have to analyze it and to evaluate it. And by being critical, as I said before, it doesn't mean that you're being negative. It means that you are being analytical about the literature. Okay, and as I say, you know, again, the literature review, why it's important, and we'll do another webinar about this short in the coming weeks. But again, it will just indicate your ability to integrate the existing literature that's there and to synthesize it and to write about it in a coherent narrative. And it should provide also new theoretical insights for your research, depending on your discipline, obviously, but that is something which your literature review should accomplish. And your methodology, you know, and again, just a distinction between your methodology and methods. So here, again, when it comes to writing about methodology and methods in a funding application, you present your research methodology, you explain why it's the most appropriate and the most effective in terms of answering your research question. And it also allows you, if you can, this would be really great if you can do this, but it allows you to justify why a particular methodology is being used and not another. And this gives you a chance. Again, this is another opportunity for you to demonstrate your knowledge of a really, really important area, such as, for example, you know, examples of methodologies. And so this would be, for example, depends obviously on your discipline. And if you're doing a professional doctorate, you might think, well, I should be thinking more about methods than methodology, because methodology is more about, if you like, the rationale for the approach that you're taking to the research. And it's, you know, it's if you like, it's like the lens through which the analysis of your research takes place. But it's an important distinction, methodology and method, and again, something that you should discuss with your supervisor, with your mentor, with your colleagues also, because I think it is a really, really important distinction. So methodology, what would we say a methodology is? This would be the broader strategy for your approach. So for example, are you going to take a qualitative approach, a quantitative approach? And for example, other examples of methodology would be depending on one's discipline, but obviously things like I mentioned ethnography, ethnomethodology, participatory studies, things like grounded theory, very, very, I suppose, in some of the social sciences, would be quite common. Things like phenomenology, which would be, if you like, describing the lived experience of the participants. So this could be a study of how people behave or how they consume. And things like, quantitative experimental studies. All of these would be, for example, types of or examples of methodology. So methodology, if you like, it's your broad strategy for conducting the research. And just to distinguish it from methods without getting too technical, but the method is what you will use. It's the tool or the instrument that you will use to collect the data or to analyze the data. So, for example, if you're conducting an analysis of a particular cohort of people and you wish to conduct, say, for example, an opinion poll or a survey or a questionnaire, all of those would be examples of methods. Or if you wish to conduct, various types of experiments and clinical trials, for example. So all of those would be, if you like, types of methods that you would use throughout your research. So it's just important, I think, to distinguish both in terms of a funding application, because what that will help you to do is to convince the reviewers that you are a very reflective researcher, and show that your awareness of concepts within research. In terms of dissemination, a lot of funding bodies, they want to see how you are going to how your research is going to have a wider impact. So how are you going to get the word out about your research? So they want to see, they want others to be helped. They want them to be supported by your research. So what do they want to see? So if you can show, benefits to wider society of your research, that I think really convinces reviewers that that your research is worth funding. Now, that isn't always the case, but it certainly is no harm to convince the reviewers that your research is going to have wider benefits simply than within academia. So think about what what's going to come out of the research. Will it be publications, a new database? Will it be, for example, are you talking about contribution to a new type of policy, for example, or development of a new technology or a new service? All of these things are part of dissemination. Now, again, you're a PhD student, so nobody is expecting you to devise something which is going to be groundbreaking and going to mark you out for as a potential contender for the Nobel Prize. That is not the case with a PhD. That will come later in your career. But just to give you examples of dissemination, what dissemination, how you can get word out about your research. Obviously, conference presentations, seminars within your university, regular reporting. And again, I hate this word, stakeholders. Like, for example, if the HSE are funding your research, they would want regular reports on what you are doing. Publications, obviously, be it, academic publications, journal articles, reviews, book chapters, exhibitions, outreach, for example, with regard to public talks or social mainstream media, public engagement events. All of these are good examples of dissemination. And ultimately, the holy grail for so many people is where their research is integrated into policy. But that is, beyond, so many of us, because that is a highly ambitious and highly highly specialist attainment. So just why applications fail. So just about to finish up. So choice of research questions, people in the wrong research questions. Sometimes the reviewers say the proposal isn't feasible. Or the methodology may not be clearly described. The importance of the attainment of certain skills can be underestimated. It could be to do with the institution itself or the supervisor. Supervisor, they may deem, does not have the necessary expertise. It could be that the institution does not support the type of research that you're doing, or doesn't have any kind of previous experience of the kinds of research that you're trying to do. It could also be that what I mean here by generic references is that you have a reference from your supervisor which conveys the impression that it has been written in a perfunctory manner. That is, that it has been written in a way that the referee doesn't really know you, doesn't know your research, has written a similar reference for other applicants. So that is why, you know, it's really important that whoever it is you get to be an academic reference are people who know your research. And it may be that there are errors throughout the application. But if you don't get funded, you know, ask for feedback, you know, and there's no harm in doing that. And look at the application again and perhaps ask someone to look at the referee's comments and to help you to help you understand why it is you didn't get funded. The reality of it is that so many Irish-based postgraduate researchers and so many of the we're so fortunate, I think, at the University of Limerick that we have so many brilliant postgraduate researchers, scholars, so many of you doing really, really excellent work. But the reality of it is that the competition for funding is so intense and so savage that a lot of brilliant applications don't get funded. And sometimes I can never figure out why when I see the feedback that comes back. And sometimes I think if I've worked in an application with someone, I think, well, this is a certainty to get funding. And then I've seen them not get funded, which can be very, very distressing for the person involved. Or it could be the case that sometimes you see an application which you know is excellent, but you think may not get funding, and it does. So sometimes it's very difficult to know. It can be to do with the composition of the panel. It can be to do with what the mission statement of the funding agency is. There are myriad reasons for why applications don't get funded, even though they are brilliant applications. So that's the reality of it, that many top-class applications don't get funded, but at the same time, many still do. And I think the average for the Irish Research Council, its average rate of acceptance or funding for applications, could be wrong about this, but the last time I looked, I have the figure of 18% in my head. So that means that almost 1 in 5 of applications get funded. So what I suppose this webinar has been trying to do is just to show you that, you know, there are certain tactics you can take as part of your strategy to improve your chances of getting funded. And just to let you know that, you know, it's time, it's a lot of time invested, but it is time also that I think is very well spent, because it really, really helps you in terms of becoming a more reflective researcher, but it also helps you to put your PhD onto a particular speedway, which I think really, really helps it in the long term, because you have thought more about by doing a funding application, you've thought more about your research question, you've thought more about your methods, your methodology, you've thought about things like your data collection, your data analysis, your findings, your schedule also, because you have to provide a Gantt chart or a milestone chart to the review, to the funding agency. So it is time well spent, but there is no guarantee, you know, even if you do write a brilliant application, that it will get funded, because, as I say, the competition is severe. But as I say, 18% of applications do get funded or tend to get funded. So that provides you with almost a 1 in 5 chance of getting funding. But again, if you don't, and I've seen many brilliant applications not get funded, as I say, you know, think of the words of Samuel Beckett, what his maxim was, you know, ever tried, ever failed, no matter, try again, fail better. And again, it can be very hard to live up to this, because if you do get, if you're not successful, it can be very, very demoralizing, but it's always worth going back. I've seen many applications to external funding bodies come back, people very disappointed, very disenchanted. But then what can happen is that they can use that information to get funding from different agencies and different funding bodies, or they can try again the following year. And I've seen so many people who were not successful the first time round when looking for external funding succeed again next time. What we're going to do is I'm going to stop the recording now so that you'll be able to get access to this later. And if you have any questions or any concerns or any observations or comments, please please let me know either in the conversation box or or if you can also turn on your microphone if you want. So thank you for your attendance, and look forward to seeing you soon.